A piercing scream slices through the first-class cabin of Flight 419 from Chicago to Seattle, as Marcus Tate, a sleekly dressed black man in his late 40s, reels back, gripping his cheek where flight attendant Karen Holt's slap just landed. Passengers freeze, jaws dropping, as Karen smirks, clueless about the firestorm she's ignited. What began as a trivial clash over a spilled drink explodes into chaos no one expected. Marcus meets her gaze, his calm fracturing, and mutters, "You'll regret this." What seismic fallout awaits them all? Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if you stand for justice against unchecked power. Hit like and subscribe for more gripping tales that expose the truth and spark change. Marcus Tate settled into his plush first-class seat on Flight 419 from Chicago to Seattle, his crisp gray suit hugging his broad frame as he adjusted his tie. With a practiced flick of his wrist, at 48, he carried the quiet swagger of a man who'd clawed his way to the top, though today he blended in like any other passenger, his sharp hazel eyes scanning the cabin with a subtle intensity. As the CEO of Horizon Wings, a luxury airline dominating the private jet scene, he wasn't here to flaunt his title. This was a routine check, a chance to slip into the shadows and see his empire through the eyes of the everyday flyer. He stashed his sleek leather briefcase under the seat, its edges worn from years of hustle, and leaned back, letting the hum of pre-flight chatter wash over him. The plane smelled faintly of overpriced cologne and recycled air, a familiar cocktail that grounded him in the world he'd built from nothing. Across the aisle, Karen Holt bustled through her duties, her weary frame darting between rows with the clipped precision of a woman who'd done this 1,000 times. In her early 30s, she wore her Navy uniform like a badge of honor, her blonde hair pulled into a tight bun that mirrored her rigid smile. She was good at her job, seasoned enough to handle a full cabin without breaking a sweat. But today her edges frayed like a rope stretched too thin. A delayed gate change had left her fuming, her thin lips twitching as she muttered complaints to no one in particular. She caught Marcus's eye as he settled in, her gaze lingering a beat too long, sizing him up with a flicker of something sour. Maybe it was his polished look, the way his suit sat just right, or maybe it was the quiet confidence that rolled off him in waves. Whatever it was, she didn't like it, and Marcus felt the weight of her stare like a pebble in his shoe. He brushed it off, reaching for the in-flight menu tucked into the seat pocket, its glossy pages crinkling under his fingers. The plane hadn't even taxied yet, and he figured he'd ease into the trip with a small request. He pressed the call button, its soft chime cutting through the cabin's low buzz, and Karen appeared moments later, her smile more a grimace than a greeting. "What do you need, sir?" she asked, her voice tight, like she was already counting the seconds until he'd stop talking. Marcus kept it simple, his tone smooth as polished stone. "Just a coffee, black, whenever you get a chance." She nodded curtly, turning on her heel, but not before he caught the faint hiss under her breath. A venomous little jab, figures he'd want it black. The words hit him like a slap before her hand ever did, a casual slice of prejudice she didn't even bother to hide. Marcus froze, his fingers tightening around the menu until the edges bent. He wasn't new to this, not by a long shot, but the sting never dulled. He leaned forward, keeping his voice low but firm, the kind of calm that carried a warning. "Excuse me, what was that?" Karen spun back, her pale cheeks flushing pink, caught off guard but not backing down. "Nothing, sir," she lied, her eyes narrowing into slits. "I'll get your coffee." She stalked off, her heels clicking against the carpeted floor, leaving Marcus to simmer in the insult. He could have let it slide, could have chalked it up to a bad day, but something in her tone gnawed at him, a spark begging to catch fire. He waited, watching her weave through the aisle, her movements jerky, like a puppet on fraying strings. Minutes later, she returned, a steaming cup of coffee clutched in her hand. The plane jolted slightly as it began its roll toward the runway, and Marcus reached out to take the drink, his fingers brushing the saucer. That's when it happened. Karen's grip faltered, or maybe it didn't, and the cup tipped, sending a scalding stream of black liquid splashing across his lap. The heat seared through his slacks, a sharp bite that made him hiss through clenched teeth. But it was her reaction that burned hotter. "Oops," she said, her voice dripping with mock surprise, a smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Guess. I slipped." Passengers nearby glanced over, some snickering behind their hands, others averting their eyes like they'd seen this script before. A white guy in a rumpled polo to seat's back muttered, "Clumsy much," and chuckled, assuming Marcus would just take it. Marcus grabbed a napkin from the armrest, dabbing at the spreading stain. His jaw tight as he fought the urge to snap. The wet fabric clung to his thighs. A humiliating mess, but he kept his cool, his voice steady as steel. "You didn't slip," he said, locking eyes with her. "You meant to do that." Karen's smirk faltered for a split second, replaced by a flash of defiance, her hands planting on her hips. "I don't know what you're talking about," she shot back, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "Maybe you shouldn't have been in my way." The cabin tilted as the plane angled upward, engines roaring to life, and Marcus felt the weight of her words settle over him, heavy as the altitude pressing against his chest. He could have escalated it then, could have demanded her name or called for the supervisor, but he didn't, not yet. He wiped the last of the coffee from his hands, folding the soaked napkin into a neat square, his mind racing. This wasn't just about a spilled drink anymore. It was about the venom behind it. The assumption that he didn't belong here, in this seat, on this plane. He'd built her eyes and wings to escape that kind of garbage, to carve out a space where respect wasn't a negotiation. And now here it was, staring him down in the form of a flight attendant who thought she could get away with it. He leaned back, forcing a slow breath, thinking he'd de-escalated the moment by staying silent. He was wrong. Karen hovered nearby, pretending to adjust a tray table, but her eyes kept flicking to him, daring him to push back. The plane leveled off, the seatbelt sign shimming off, and Marcus decided to test her one more time. He pressed the call button again, its ping slicing through the cabin's hum. She stormed over, her face a mask of barely contained irritation. "What now?" she snapped, dropping all pretense of politeness. Marcus held up the damp napkin, his voice even. "I'd like a replacement for the coffee you spilled." Her jaw tightened, a muscle twitching in her cheek, and for a moment, he thought she'd just walk away. Instead, she leaned in close, her breath hot against his ear as she hissed, "You're pushing your luck, buddy." That was the match to the gasoline. Marcus straightened, his calm cracking just enough to let the fire peek through. "I'm not your buddy," he said, each word deliberate, "and I'd like you to do your job." The air between them thickened, electric with unspoken venom. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, sensing the brewing storm, but no one spoke up. Karen's hand twitched at her side, her nails digging into her palm, and Marcus saw it coming, a heartbeat. Too late. Her palm swung fast, a sharp crack splitting the silence as it connected with his cheek, the sting blooming hot and instant across his skin. His head snapped to the side, his hand flying to the spot where her fingers had left a faint red imprint, and the cabin erupted into gasps and whispers. She stepped back, her chest heaving, a triumphant glint in her eyes as if she'd just won something. Marcus stared at her, his pulse hammering in his ears, the humiliation warring with the rage bubbling under his ribs. He'd kept his cool, played it smart, and still she'd crossed a line he hadn't expected her to touch. The coffee stain on his lap felt trivial now, a footnote to the raw, unfiltered prejudice she'd just unleashed. He rubbed his cheek, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You have no idea what you just started." Karen smirked again, oblivious to the depth of her mistake, turning away like she'd already dismissed him. But Marcus knew this was only the beginning, a spark that would ignite a blaze she couldn't outrun. The sharp crack of Karen Holt's slap still hung in the air of Flight for 19's first-class cabin. A jagged wound in the hum of the plane's engines as Marcus Tate sat rigid, his cheek throbbing with a heat that rivaled the coffee stain soaking his gray slacks. His hazel eyes, usually steady as a hawk's, flashed with a storm he barely contained, his fingers brushing the tender spot where her palm had landed. Round him, the cabin jolted to life, passengers sucking in breaths like they'd just witnessed a car wreck. A woman in a crimson blazer clutched her pearls, her wide eyes darting between Marcus and Karen, while a guy in a faded Cubs cap yanked out his phone, thumbing the record button with a shaky grin. The air buzzed with shock, a live wire sparking chaos, and Marcus felt every stare like a spotlight burning into his skin. Karen stood there, chest puffed out, her weary frame trembling with a mix of adrenaline and defiance. Her blonde bun had loosened a strand dangling over her flushed face, but that smirk, oh, that smirk stayed glued on. A badge of victory she wore like she'd just tamed a wild animal. "You don't belong in first class," she barked, her voice slicing through the murmurs, loud enough to make a kid 3 rows back flinch. The words weren't just an insult. They were a declaration, a line drawn in the sand with Marcus on the wrong side. Passengers shifted, some nodding faintly, others whispering behind cupped hands, their assumptions aligning with her venom faster than Marcus could blink. He opened his mouth to fire back, but before he could, Tom, a lanky flight attendant with a nervous twitch, stumbled over, his hands flapping like a bird caught in a net. "Karen, cool it," he muttered, grabbing her elbow, but she jerked free, shoving him so hard he nearly tripped into a tray table. Marcus watched the scene unfold, his pulse hammering a war drum in his chest. He'd dealt with bigots before, built her eyes and wings to rise above them, but this was a sucker punch he hadn't braced for. Karen's shove sent Tom reeling, and she spun back to Marcus, pointing a trembling finger. "He started it," she snapped, her lie so bold it almost sounded convincing. The guy with the phone zoomed in, his lens catching every twitch of her face, while the woman in the blazer gasped, "That's not true." But her voice drowned in the rising tide of whispers, the cabin splitting into spectators and silent judges. Marcus straightened, his jaw tight as he reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out his platinum boarding pass, its edges glinting under the overhead lights. "Check my ticket," he said, his voice low but cutting, a blade wrapped in velvet. He held it out, expecting the truth to slap her back. Karen snatched it, her eyes skimming the embossed text. But instead of faltering, she scoffed, a harsh bark of a laugh escaping her lips. "This, probably fake," she sneered, tossing it onto his lap like it was trash. The pass fluttered, landing crooked on the coffee-stained fabric, and Marcus's stomach twisted. Fake? He'd designed those passes himself, poured years into, making her eyes and wings a name that meant something. He clenched his fists, nails digging into his palms, thinking he'd won this round by staying cool, by letting the evidence speak. But Karen didn't flinch. She turned on her heel, her heels stabbing the carpet as she stormed to the galley. Her silhouette vanishing behind the curtain, the cabin simmered, passengers exchanging glances, some smirking like they'd called it all along, others frowning, but too timid to speak. Marcus leaned back, forcing a slow breath, his mind racing. He'd shut her down, right? Showed her up with cold, hard proof. Then the intercom crackled, a static hiss that made his gut lurch. "Attention, this is your captain. We've got a security issue in first class. Ground crew's been alerted." The voice was clipped, authoritative, and Marcus's blood ran cold. Security issue? He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't lifted a finger, but Karen's lie had already taken flight, soaring faster than the plane, cutting through the clouds. Passengers turned, their stares sharpening into suspicion. The guy with the phone muttering, "Told you he was trouble." The woman in the blazer shook her head, but her protest was a whisper lost in the growing hum of judgment. Marcus gripped the armrests, his knuckles paling, the sting on his cheek now a dull ache compared to the betrayal sinking into his bones. He'd played it smart, kept his cool, and still she'd twisted it, painted him as the villain in a story he hadn't written. The cabin lights flickered as the plane hit a pocket of turbulence, a jolt that mirrored the chaos brewing inside him. Karen's smirk flashed in his mind, that triumphant glint promising more than just a slap. He'd thought he'd won by staying above her petty game, by flashing that platinum pass like a shield. But she'd turned it into a weapon, her lie racing ahead to tighten a noose he hadn't seen coming. His cheek burned, a reminder of her audacity. But now it was her words over the intercom that echoed louder, a signal that this was far from over. What had he unleashed by stepping onto this flight? Who was Karen about to drag into this mess? The engines roared, carrying him toward a storm he couldn't outrun, and the cabin watched, waiting for the next blow to land. "Hey, folks, What do you think about this twist? Comment number 1 if you're raging at Karen's bold-faced lie, or number 2 if you think Marcus should have fought back harder from the jump. Hit that like button if you're hooked on this wild ride, and smash subscribe to catch every jaw-dropping turn as Marcus battles this nightmare at 30,000 feet. Was Karen's move a power play or pure panic? How far will her lie stretch before it snaps? Stick around, because the captain's about to step in, and trust me, you won't see what's coming next. The intercom's static faded, leaving a heavy silence in the first-class cabin of Flight 419, broken only by the steady thrum of engines cutting through the sky from Chicago to Seattle. Marcus Tate sat stiffly, his platinum boarding pass still, crumpled on his coffee-stained lap, its sheen dulled by Karen Holt's dismissal. His cheek pulsed with a lingering sting, but it was the captain's voice, cold and clipped, that twisted his gut now. Security issue in first class. The words looped in his head, a false accusation spiraling out of his control. Passengers shifted uneasily, their eyes darting to him like he was a lit fuse, while the guy in the Cubs cap kept filming, his phone a silent witness to the chaos Karen had unleashed. Marcus flexed his fingers, trying to shake the disbelief creeping up his spine. He'd shown his ticket, stayed calm, and still the tide was turning against him. The galley curtain whipped open, and Captain Richard Dunn strode out, a hulking figure in his 50s with a buzz cut and a jaw carved from granite. His pilot's jacket stretched tight across his broad shoulders, badges glinting like medals from a war he'd never lost. An ex-cop, his presence screamed authority, the kind that didn't bend or question. His steel-gray eyes locked on Marcus before he'd even crossed half the aisle. A predator sizing up prey. Karen trailed behind, her smirk replaced by a nervous twitch, though her chin stayed high, like she'd just handed Richard a gift-trapped problem to solve. Tom, the lanky attendant, hovered near the bulkhead, wringing his hands, his freckled face pale as he watched the captain approach. The air thickened, a storm brewing in the tight confines of the cabin, and Marcus felt the weight of every stare pinning him in place. Richard stopped inches from Marcus's seat, his boots planting firmly on the carpet, his shadow swallowing the light from the window. "Sir, we don't tolerate disruptions," he growled, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the armrests. The words hit like a gavel, no room for debate, and Marcus blinked, stunned by the instant verdict. He opened his mouth to explain, his tone steady despite the fire licking at his ribs. "Captain, I didn't disrupt anything. Your attendant slapped me over a spilled drink. Check the footage, ask the passengers." He gestured vaguely toward the guy with the phone, hoping for a lifeline, but Richard's gaze didn't waver. Hard and unyielding as concrete, Karen stepped closer, her voice pitching up with rehearsed indignation. "He's lying. He provoked me. Kept pushing after I warned him." Her lie was seamless now, polished by the seconds she'd had to spin it. Richard's head tilted slightly, his lips curling into a sneer as he ignored Marcus's plea and zeroed in on the boarding pass, still resting on his lap. "Let's see some ID," he demanded, his thick fingers snapping impatiently. Marcus reached into his jacket, pulling out his leather wallet with a deliberate slowness, his mind racing. He handed over his driver's license, the plastic gleaming under the cabin lights, expecting it to clear the air. He was Marcus Tate, CEO of Horizon Wings, not some troublemaker. This had to end here. Richard snatched the card, his meaty hand, dwarfing it as he squinted at the details, his brow furrowed. Then his sneer deepened, a crack of disdain splitting his face. "Look suspicious," he muttered, loud enough for the front rows to hear. "Suspicious?" Marcus's stomach dropped, the word a slap worse than Karen's. His license was pristine, issued in Illinois, photo crisp, name unmistakable. But Richard didn't care. He tucked it into his pocket, turning to the radio clip to his belt. "Ground control, this is Captain Dunn. Got a potential risk in first class, male, mid-40s. Flagging him now." The static reply buzzed, a garbled confirmation, and Marcus's breath caught. Flagged? On his own plane? He leaned forward, his voice sharpening, a blade unsheathed. "That's my ID, Captain. I'm not a risk. I'm a passenger. You've got no grounds for this." Richard wheeled back, his bulk looming closer. his breath sour with coffee and contempt. "I've got all the grounds I need," he snapped. "You're a problem, and I don't take chances." The cabin shrank, the walls pressing in as passengers murmured, their whispers a chorus of doubt. The woman in the crimson blazer clutched her armrest, her lips parting like she might speak. But Richard's glare silenced her. Marcus's mind spun. He could end this now. Drop the bombshell that he owned her eyes and wings, forced Richard to back off. He opened his mouth, the words forming, "I'm the CEO." But Richard cut him off, snatching Marcus's burner phone from the seat pocket where he'd left it. "No devices." Richard barked, his fingers closing around the sleek black case. "Protocol for security threats." Marcus lunged forward, instinct kicking in. But Richard stepped back, dangling the phone like a taunt. "You don't touch me, boy," he hissed, the slur slipping out so casually it might have been habit. "Boy." The word landed like a brick, shattering Marcus's restraint. His fists clenched, nails biting into his palms, but he forced himself. Still, knowing a swing would bury him deeper, Richard smirked, pocketing the phone alongside the license, his victory sealed. Karen folded her arms, a flicker of triumph flashing in her blue eyes, while Tom shrank against the bulkhead, his eyes pleading for this to stop. It didn't. Marcus sank back, his chest heaving, the coffee stain cold and sticky against his thighs. He'd thought revealing his identity would flip the script, make Richard hesitate, maybe even apologize. Instead, the captain had doubled down, stripping him of proof and voice in one swift move. The cabin watched, a jury already swayed. The guy in the Cubs cap zooming in on Marcus's defeat. The woman in the blazer looked away, her hands trembling, while a kid in a hoodie muttered, "Should have stayed quiet." Systemic bias wasn't new to Marcus. He'd faced it in boardrooms and backstreets, but this was a vice tightening around him at 30,000 feet, with no escape hatch. Richard turned to Karen, his voice low but audible. "Keep an eye on him. We're not done." She nodded, her smirk creeping back, a predator scenting blood. The plane hummed on, slicing through clouds, but Marcus felt like he was sinking, the altitude a cruel irony to his freefall. His cheek ached, a dull echo of Karen's slap. But Richard's hostility was the real blow, a wall of power he couldn't punch through. He'd built her eyes and wings to defy this garbage, to prove a black man could own the skies, and now his own captain was tearing it down. Brick by brick, the license in Richard's pocket, the phone in his grip, they were lifelines snipped, leaving Marcus exposed, a target painted on his back. He'd thought he'd won by keeping his head, by playing the game their way, but the rules had shifted, rigged against him from the jump. Richard's radio crackled again, a faint voice from ground control confirming the flag, and Marcus's gut twisted tighter. What had Karen whispered to set this off? How far would Richard take it before the truth clawed its way out? The engines droned, a relentless pulse matching the fury simmering in his veins. He stared at the seatback ahead, its worn fabric blurring as he replayed the moment. He'd handed over his ID, expecting justice, and got a slap of a different kind, one that cut deeper because it came from above. Richard's sneer, Karen's lie. They were a tag team, and he was the punching bag. But he wasn't done, not yet. His mind ticked, searching for a move, a crack in their armor. He'd built an empire from less than this, turned slights into fuel. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, a flicker that mirrored the storm brewing inside. Him, and he vowed silently they'd regret underestimating him. The plane soared on, oblivious to the war igniting below, a war Marcus hadn't started, but would damn sure finish. The first-class cabin of Flight for 19 hummed with a brittle tension, the air thick as molasses as Marcus Tate sat pinned by Captain Richard Dunn's shadow, his coffee-stained slacks clinging to his legs like a second skin. His cheeks still throbbed from Karen Holt's slap, but it was the loss of his phone and license, now tucked smugly in Richard's pocket, that gnawed at him, a raw wound festering under the cabin's fluorescent glow. The plane sliced through the night sky, Chicago long behind and Seattle still a distant speck. But Marcus felt trapped in a cage 30,000 feet high. Passengers darted glances his way, their eyes a mix of curiosity and unease, while the guy in the Cubs cap kept his phone rolling, capturing every flinch. Karen lingered near the galley, her weary frame taut with a predator's poise, her smirk a faint ghost on her lips as she watched Richard loom over Marcus. Like a vulture circling carrion, a rustle broke the stillness, and Marcus's gaze snapped. To Greg, a stocky white guy in a wrinkled button-down, seated to Rose's back. He'd been filming since the slap, his phone a steady witness, and now he shuffled forward, his sneakers scuffing the carpet. His round face was flushed, beads of sweat dotting his forehead, but his brown eyes held a flicker of resolve as he leaned in close. "Hey, man," Greg whispered, his voice a conspiratorial hush. "I saw it all. That slap, her lie, everything. I'll back you up when we land." Marcus's chest loosened, a thread of hope stitching through the dread. He nodded slightly, keeping his expression neutral, but inside, he latched onto Greg's words like a lifeline. An ally, someone who'd seen the truth, could shift this mess. He murmured back, "Appreciate it. Just keep that footage safe." Greg gave a quick thumbs up, retreating to his seat, and Marcus felt a spark ignite. Maybe he wasn't alone in this after all. The moment shattered as Richard pivoted, his steel-gray eyes catching Greg's retreat. His lips twisted into a scowl, and he stomped over, his boots thudding like hammer strikes. "You got something to say," he barked, towering over Greg's seat. Greg shrank, his shoulders hunching, his phone slipping to his lap, and no, just stretching. He stammered, his voice cracking. Richard's glare bore down, a silent threat, and Greg's resolve melted like ice in a furnace. He glanced at Marcus, his eyes pleading apology, then muttered, "Look, man, just don't make it worse, okay?" The words hit Marcus like a sucker. Punch, his hope snuffed out in a heartbeat. Greg wasn't an ally, he was a coward, folding under Richard's shadow. The guy in the Cubs cap snorted, his lens swiveling back to Marcus, while the woman in the crimson blazer sighed, her hands twisting in her lap. Betrayal tasted bitter, but Marcus swallowed it, his jaw tightening. He'd find another way. Karen sauntered back, her heels clicking a smug rhythm, and stopped beside Marcus's seat. Her blue eyes glinted with malice as she leaned in, her voice a syrupy drawl. "Sorry if you felt offended earlier," she said, the words dripping with insincerity, her lips curling just enough to taunt him. It was a fake apology, a jab meant to provoke, and Marcus saw through it like glass. He didn't bite, didn't give her the reaction she craved. Instead, he slipped his hand to his wrist, activating the hidden smartwatch he'd kept as a backup, its tiny mic purring to life. "No problem," he said, his tone flat, but his mind sharp, recording every syllable of her mockery. "I'll let it slide." The watch's red dot blinked faintly under his cuff, a secret weapon she didn't suspect. He leaned back, a flicker of triumph warming his chest. This was leverage, proof he could wield when the time was right. He'd outsmarted her this time, turned her game against her. The victory lasted seconds. Richard's bulk shifted, his eagle eyes catching the glint of the watch as Marcus adjusted his sleeve. "What's that?" he growled, lunging forward before Marcus could react, his meaty hand clamped around Marcus's wrist, yanking it up with a force that made his shoulder pop. Marcus twisted, trying to pull free, but Richard's grip was iron, his fingers digging into flesh. "No tricks," he snarled, ripping the watch off with a snap of elastic that stung Marcus's skin. The device dangled from his fist, its screen flickering, and Marcus's heart sank, his ace slipping away. "You think you're slick," Richard sneered, his voice a low rumble of contempt. He raised the watch high, then slammed it down onto the tray table, the crack of metal on plastic echoing like a gunshot. The screen shattered, jagged lines spidering across it, and Richard tossed the wreckage onto Marcus's lap, a pile of broken hope next to the crumpled boarding pass. Marcus stared at the wreckage, his breath shallow, the sting on his wrist a dull echo of the slap. The cabin spun, passengers gasping, the guy in the Cubs cap zooming in on the debris. Karen folded her arms, her smirk blooming into a full grin, while Tom flinched near the galley, his hands fluttering uselessly. The woman in the crimson blazer whispered, "That's too far," but her voice was a feather against the storm. Richard loomed closer, his breath hot and sour as he leaned in. "You're done playing games." He hissed, the word boy unspoken but heavy in his tone. Marcus's fists balled, his nails carving crescents into his palms, but he held. Still, knowing a fight would only bury him deeper. The watch was gone, his evidence smashed, and Greg's betrayal stung sharper now. A double blow that left him reeling. He'd thought he'd won, thought the recording would tip the scales, expose Karen's venom and Richard's bias. Instead, he'd lost more ground. His clever move crushed under Richard's boot. The cabin watched. A jury of strangers already swayed, their whispers a chorus of doubt. The guy in the hoodie muttered, "He's just making it worse," while the kid 3 rows back stared, wide-eyed, like this was some twisted in-flight movie. Marcus's chest burned, the coffee stain a cold reminder of how this started. Now dwarfed by the wreckage of his plan, Richard stepped back, pocketing his radio, his sneer a promise of more to come. Karen's eyes danced with triumph, her lie. Growing legs, and Marcus felt the walls closing in, the altitude a cruel cage he couldn't break. The plane droned on, its engines a steady roar that mocked his silence. He'd built her eyes and wings to defy this, to rise above the slurs and the sneers. And now his own crew was tearing it apart, piece by piece. Greg's cowardice, Richard's violence. They were a tag team of betrayal, and he was the punching bag. Stripped of proof and allies in one brutal swoop, the smartwatch's shards glinted on his lap, a graveyard of his fleeting victory, and he brushed them aside, his mind ticking. He'd lost this round, but he wasn't out. Not yet. Richard's radio crackled faintly, a hint of ground control's response, and Marcus's gut tightened. What was coming next? How much deeper could this spiral before he clawed his way back? The cabin lights buzzed, casting harsh shadows across his face, and he stared at the seat back ahead, its worn fabric a blur. He'd played it smart, kept his cool, and still they'd turned it against him. A rigged game he hadn't seen coming. But he'd faced worse, turned scraps into empires. The sting on his wrist, the ache in his cheek, they were fuel now, simmering. Under his skin, Richard and Karen thought they'd won, thought they'd broken him. They were wrong. The plane soared on, oblivious to the war raging below. A war Marcus would fight with every ounce of grit he had left. The first-class cabin of Flight 419 trembled faintly, a ripple of turbulence mirroring the chaos churning inside Marcus Tate as he sat, his wrists still raw from Captain Richard Dunn's grip, the shattered remnants of his smartwatch scattered across his lap like fallen soldiers. The coffee stain on his gray slacks had dried into a stiff, dark patch, a humiliating badge of Karen Holt's first strike, but it was the loss of his phone, his license, and now his recording that clawed at him, stripping him bare at 30,000 feet. The plane's engines droned a relentless hymn, carrying them from Chicago towards Seattle, but Marcus felt like he was plummeting, the altitude a mocking contrast to his sinking reality. Passengers stared, their eyes glinting with suspicion, the guy in the Cubs cap still filming, his phone a relentless eye, while Greg slumped in his seat, head down, his betrayal a silent wound festering between them. Richard loomed near the galley, his broad frame a wall of authority, his radio clutched in one meaty hand as he muttered into it, his voice a low growl lost to the cabin's hum. Karen stood beside him, her weary figure buzzing with a nervous energy, her blonde bun unraveling further as she darted glances at Marcus, her smirk now a thin, jagged line. The woman in the crimson blazer clutched her armrest, her knuckles white, while the kid in the hoodie whispered to his mom, "He's in big trouble now." Marcus forced a slow breath, his hazel eyes narrowing as he pieced together his next move. He'd lost his evidence, his ally, but he wasn't defenseless. Tucked in his sock, a slim burner phone pressed against his ankle, a last-ditch lifeline. He'd kept hidden. He shifted subtly, feeling its weight, a flicker of hope sparking in his chest. The radio crackled, sharp and sudden, cutting through the cabin's tension like a knife. "Flight 419, this is Seattle Ground Control," a tinny voice announced, loud enough for the front rows to hear. Passenger Marcus Tate flagged as disruptive. Banned from future Horizon Wings flights, effective immediately. The words slammed into Marcus like a freight train, his breath catching as the cabin erupted in whispers. Banned? From his own airline? His empire, built from sleepless nights and scraped together loans, now spitting him out like trash. The guy in the Cubs cap grinned, zooming in, while a woman in a teal scarf gasped, "That's harsh." Karen's smirk widened, her blue eyes glinting with triumph, her lie now a noose tightening around Marcus's neck. He clenched his jaw, his nails digging into his palms, the sting on his cheek a faint echo of the rage boiling under his skin. She thought she'd won, thought she'd buried him with one vicious twist. Marcus wouldn't let her have it. He slipped, his hand down, fishing the burner phone from his sock with a practiced flick. Keeping it low beneath the tray table, his fingers danced across the screen, texting Lena, his coup, a woman who'd stood by him since the early days when Horizon was just a dream scribbled on napkins. "Karen's framed me. Ground controls banned me from HW. Fix this," he typed, hitting send with a thumb that trembled only slightly. The message zipped off, a silent arrow piercing the chaos, and Marcus leaned back, his pulse steadying. Lena was a pit bull in a pantsuit. She'd tear through this mess. A reply pinged seconds later on it. "Calling legal now." Relief washed over him, cool and fleeting, a lifeline in the storm. He'd turned the tide, hadn't he? Gotten ahead of Karen's game? The radio crackled again, and Richard snatched it up, his gruff voice barking a response Marcus couldn't catch. The captain's face hardened, his steel-gray eyes flicking to Marcus with a glint of menace, and then the intercom flared to life, Richard's voice booming through the cabin. "This is your captain. We've got an update. FBI's been alerted. Possible threat on board. Stay seated, stay calm." The cabin froze, a collective gasp sucking the air dry. FBI. Marcus's stomach plummeted, the burner phone slipping in his sweaty grip. A threat. Karen's lie had metastasized, leaping from a petty dispute to a federal manhunt in minutes. Passengers recoiled, the woman in the crimson blazer shrinking into her seat, while the guy in the hoodie yelped, "He's a terrorist." The guy in the Cubs cap swung his phone, capturing the panic, his grin replaced by wide-eyed shock. Marcus stared at Richard, his mind racing, the pieces snapping into place. Karen hadn't just flagged him, she'd painted him as dangerous. A black man in first class, suddenly a national security risk. His text to Lena felt like a pebble against a tidal wave now, his victory evaporating before it could take root. Richard stomped over, his boots thudding, and leaned in close, his breath hot and sour. "You're done, Tate," he snarled, his voice a low rumble of contempt. "Feds'll sort you out when we land." Karen hovered behind, her smirk a full-blown grin, her hands clasped like she'd just won the lottery. Marcus gripped the armrests, his knuckles paling, the burner phone hidden beneath his thigh. He'd thought Lena's intervention would stop this, thought he'd outmaneuvered them. But Karen's lie had grown claws, and Richard was sharpening them. The cabin spun, a kaleidoscope of fear and judgment, passengers whispering, "FBI." Like it was a death sentence, the kid's mom pulled him closer, her eyes darting to Marcus like he might explode. The woman in the teal scarf clutched her purse, muttering, "Should have known." Marcus's chest burned, the coffee stain a trivial scar compared to the brand Karen had seared into him now. He'd built Horizon wings to escape this, to prove a black man could own the skies. And now his own plane was a battlefield, his own. "Crew the enemy." The burner phone buzzed faintly, another text from Lena, but he couldn't check it. Not with Richard's shadow swallowing him whole. His fleeting triumph was ash, scattered by a lie so big it threatened to crush him before he could fight back. The engines roared on, a steady pulse that mocked his unraveling world. He'd thought he'd won, thought the burner phone would save him. But Karen's venom had spread too fast, too far. Richard's sneer, the passengers' fear, they were a wall closing in, and he was running out of moves. The plane soared through the night, oblivious to the war below. A war Marcus hadn't started but couldn't escape. His cheek ached, a dull reminder of the slap that sparked this, now dwarfed by the federal shadow looming ahead. How had it spiraled this far? What would the FBI do when they landed? Yo, what's your take on this insane escalation? Comment number 1 if you're furious at Karen's lie turning Marcus into a federal target. Or number 2 if you think he should have stayed quiet and avoided this mess. Smash that like button if you're gripped by this nightmare unfolding in the sky, and hit subscribe to catch every brutal twist as Marcus fights for his life. Was his burner phone a genius move or a desperate flail? How much worse can this get before he breaks free? Buckle up, because the passengers are about to turn on him, and you won't believe what happens next. The first-class cabin of Flight for 119 shuddered faintly, a tremor of unease rippling through the stale air as Marcus Tate sat rigid, the burner phone pressed against his thigh, its faint buzz a lifeline drowned by the intercom's chilling echo. FBI's been alerted, possible threat on board. His coffee-stained slacks clung to his legs, a cold, stiff reminder of Karen Holt's opening salvo, but it was the weight of 30 pairs of eyes, glinting with fear and accusation, that pinned him now. The plane carved a path through the night sky, Chicago to Seattle, but Marcus felt like he was sinking into quicksand, the altitude a cruel illusion of freedom. The guy in the Cubs cap kept filming, his phone a relentless spotlight, while the woman in the crimson blazer shrank into her seat, her hands trembling like leaves in a storm. The kid in the hoodie stared, wide-eyed, his mom whispering, "Stay close," as if Marcus might lunge at any second. Captain Richard Dunn stood near, the galley, his broad frame a sentinel of menace, his steel-gray eyes flicking over the cabin like a warden counting prisoners. Karen hovered beside him, her weary body coiled with a restless energy, her blonde bun fraying into wisps that framed her triumphant smirk. The passengers, spooked by the threat label, began to stir, their whispers swelling into a low, angry hum. A burly man in a faded flannel shirt, seated 3 rows back, lurched to his feet, his face ruddy with booze and rage. "He's dangerous," he bellowed, his voice a gravelly roar that jolted the cabin awake. He stumbled forward, his meaty fist jabbing the air, and shoved Marcus hard, his shoulders slamming into the seatback with a thud that rattled the tray table. Marcus grunted, pain blooming sharp and hot, but he didn't flinch, his hazel eyes locking onto the man's bloodshot glare. The shove was a match to dry grass. A woman in a teal scarf sprang up, her purse swinging wildly as she hurled a crumpled magazine at Marcus, its pages flapping like a wounded bird before smacking his chest. "Get him out of here," she shrieked, her voice shrill with panic. Others joined, a chorus of hate erupting as trash rained down. A plastic cup bounced off his shoulder, a wad of gum stuck to his jacket, and a half-eaten pretzel hit his lap, smearing salt into the coffee stain. The guy in the Cubs cap laughed, zooming in, while the kid in the hoodie tossed a candy wrapper, his mom nodding approval. Marcus's pulse hammered, his fists clenching as the mob's venom washed over him, a tidal wave of racism he'd faced too many times, but never like this, not trapped in a metal tube hurtling through the sky. He couldn't just sit there. Marcus surged to his feet, his 6-foot frame unfolding with a quiet power, and grabbed the burly man's wrist mid-shove, twisting it back with a snap that made the guy yelp. "Back off," Marcus growled, his voice a low rumble of steel, his grip iron-tight. He shoved the man into his seat, pinning him briefly against the cushion, the flannel stretching taut across his heaving chest. A few passengers cheered, a fleeting ripple of support. The woman in the crimson blazer clapped softly, her eyes glinting with relief, while a guy in a pinstripe suit nodded, muttering, "Good for him." Marcus stood tall, his breath steadying, the burner phone still hidden beneath his thigh. He'd fought back, shut them down, taken control. The mob hesitated, their fury stalling, and he thought he'd won, thought he'd turned the tide with one bold move. Then Karen struck. She darted from the galley, her heels clicking a frantic beat, a silver canister gleaming in her hand. "Enough," she screamed, her voice piercing the chaos. And before Marcus could react, she thrust the pepper spray forward, blasting a stinging cloud straight into his face. The burn hit like wildfire, a searing agony that clawed at his eyes, nose, and throat, doubling him over in a choking gasp. Tears streamed down his cheeks, his vision blurring into a red haze as he stumbled back, his hands flailing for balance. The cabin erupted again, passengers shouting, "Get him!" As the spray's acrid stench filled the air, Marcus coughed, his lungs seizing, the taste of chemicals bitter on his tongue, and crashed into his seat, the world spinning around him. Richard was on him in seconds, his boots stomping closer as Marcus wheezed, blind and helpless. "That's enough," the captain roared, but not at Karen, at Marcus. His meaty hands yanked Marcus upright, wrenching his arms behind his back with a force that popped his shoulders. Cold metal bit into his wrists as Richard snapped handcuffs on, the click of death knell echoing in Marcus's ears. "You're done," Richard snarled, shoving him down into the seat, the cuffs digging into his flesh. Marcus's head lolled, his eyes streaming, the pepper spray still scorching his face. But he caught Karen's grin through the haze, a vicious slash of triumph as she pocketed the canister. The mob cheered her, the burly man pumping a fist, the woman in the teal scarf clapping like she'd just seen justice served. The victory he'd tasted was gone, snatched away by Karen's savage escalation. His chest heaved, each breath a ragged fight against the burn, the cuffs of ice pinning him to defeat. The guy in the Cubs cap zoomed in on his crumpled form, the lens drinking in his misery, while the kid in the hoodie whispered, "Told you he was bad." The woman in the crimson blazer looked away, her hands trembling, her fleeting support. Drowned by the mob's hate, Marcus's mind reeled, the burner phone still under his thigh. Useless now as his strength ebbed. He'd fought back, pinned the guy, thought he'd reclaim some ground. But Karen's cruelty and Richard's force had buried him deeper. A one-two punch that left him gasping. The plane droned on, its engines a steady hum that mocked his collapse. He'd built her eyes and wings to rise above this, to prove a black man could command respect. And now his own passengers were a lynch mob, his crew their ringleaders. The cuffs cut into his wrists, the pepper spray lingered in his lungs, and the coffee stain felt like a child's scribble compared to the scars this night was carving. Richard stepped back, his sneer a promise of more, while Karen folded her arms, her grin a blade twisting in his gut. The mob settled, their fury sated for now, but Marcus knew this wasn't the end. His cheek burned, a faint echo of the slap that started it, now lost in the storm of hate raining down. How had he misjudged them so badly? What could he do, cuffed and blinded, to claw his way back? The cabin lights flickered, casting jagged shadows across his blurred vision, and he slumped against the seat, his breath shallow. He'd thought he'd won, thought his fight would shift the tide, but they'd turned it against him. A rigged game he couldn't outrun. The burner phone buzzed faintly, a lifeline he couldn't reach, and his mind ticked, searching for a crack in their armor. He'd faced worse, turned slights into empires, but this was a beast he hadn't tamed. The plane soared through the night, oblivious to the war below, a war Marcus was losing. Round by brutal round, but he wasn't broken, not yet. The cuffs, the spray, the mob, they were fuel now, simmering in his veins, waiting for the spark to ignite. The first-class cabin of Flight for 19 vibrated with a low, steady hum, the engines slicing through the night sky from Chicago to Seattle. But Marcus Tate felt none of its momentum. His wrists chafed raw by the handcuffs biting into his flesh, his eyes still stung from Karen Holt's pepper spray, a dull burn that blurred the edges of his vision, while the coffee stain on his gray slacks clung like a badge of shame, now joined by the salty grit of pretzel crumbs from the mob's assault. His throat rasped with each breath, the chemical tang lingering, and the burner phone pressed against his thigh buzzed faintly, a lifeline he couldn't reach with his hands bound. Passengers settled into an uneasy quiet, their hate sated for. Now, the guy in the Cubs cap lowering his phone, though his lens still flicked to Marcus intermittently. The woman in the crimson blazer stared out the window, her hands clasped tight, while the burly man in flannel slumped in his seat, nursing his twisted wrist with a scowl. Captain Richard Dunn stood near the galley, his broad silhouette a wall of menace, his steel-gray eyes scanning the cabin with a predator's calm. Karen hovered beside him, her weary frame buzzing with a restless triumph, her blonde bun a chaotic mess of strands framing her pinched face. Marcus slumped against the seat back, his head throbbing, the cuffs a constant ache as he fought to steady his mind. The FBI threat loomed like a guillotine, Karen's life spinning out of control. But the burner phone's buzz kept him anchored. Lena, his coup, was out there, a bulldog in the fight, and he clung to that, a ember glowing in the dark. The plane droned on, its altitude a cruel mockery of his confinement, and he waited, Counting the seconds for her to pull him out of this abyss, the burner buzzed again, a sharp pulse against his leg, and Marcus shifted, his cuffed hands useless. As he strained to glance down, Richard's shadow shifted, but he didn't notice. Too busy muttering into his radio, Marcus tilted his head, catching a glimpse of the screen's faint glow beneath his thigh, boards grounding the plane in. Boise, safety concerns, legals on it. Relief flooded him, a cool wave washing over the fire in his chest. Boise was closer, an emergency landing that could end this nightmare early. Lena was moving mountains, rallying the troops, and he could almost taste freedom, the cuffs a temporary shackle soon to snap. He leaned back, his breath evening out, the sting in his eyes fading to a dull ache. He'd thought he'd lost everything: his watch, his ally, his dignity, but Lena's play was a checkmate, wasn't it? A way out before the FBI could sink their claws in. The buzz came again, sharper, insistent, and Marcus risked another glance, his heart thudding as he read Lena's next words. Karen's uncle's on the board. He's pushing to fire you. Watch your back. The relief curdled, souring into dread as the cabin seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in tight. Karen's uncle. On his board, his mind raced, piecing it together. Horizon Wings wasn't just betraying him, it was personal now, a knife wielded by family ties he hadn't seen coming. Karen's smirk made sense, her audacity rooted deeper than he'd guessed. He'd built this company, handpicked every board member, but this unklesome shadowy figure he couldn't place had slipped through, a viper in his nest. The burner slipped slightly, sweat slicking his thigh, and Marcus's gut twisted. His own empire was turning on him, and he was cuffed, helpless, a king dethroned mid-flight. He needed an ally, someone on the inside. Tom, the lanky attendant, lingered near the bulkhead, his freckled face pale, his hands fidgeting with a napkin. Marcus caught his eye, a fleeting lock, and whispered, "Tom, I'm Horizon's CEO. This is a setup." His voice was hoarse, barely audible over the engines, but Tom's eyes widened, a spark of belief flickering in his nervous gaze. He hesitated, glancing at Richard, then shuffled closer, his sneakers silent on the carpet. "You're serious?" he breathed, his voice a shaky thread. Marcus nodded, his jaw tight. "Check my records when we land." "Help me now." Tom swallowed hard, then knelt swiftly, his fingers fumbling with the cuff's lock. The click was soft, a secret snap, and Marcus's wrists sprang free, blood rushing back with a pins and needles sting. Tom slipped back, his eyes darting, and Marcus flexed his hands, a surge of power coursing through him. He'd turned it around, hadn't he? Gotten loose, gained a foothold. Richard's roar shattered the moment. "What the hell?" he bellowed, his bulk charging forward as he spotted Marcus's freed hands. The captain's fist swung, a battering ram of knuckles that caught Marcus's shoulder, sending him crashing back into the seat with a grunt. The burner phone skittered across the floor, its screen flashing Lena's text before Richard's boot stomped down, cracking it into a web of glass and plastic. "You're done," Richard snarled, his face inches from Marcus's, his breath hot with fury. "No more games, Tate." Karen rushed over, her heels stabbing the carpet, her smirk morphing into a gleeful cackle as she saw the wreckage. "Told you he's trouble," she chirped, her voice a venomous sing-song. The passengers stirred, the burly man muttering, "Should've kept him locked," while the woman in the teal scarf nodded, her purse clutched tight. Marcus's shoulder throbbed, a deep bruise blooming under his jacket. But it was the loss of the burner that gutted him, his last link to Lena crushed under Richard's heel. He'd thought he'd won, thought Tom's move would shift the balance, give him room to breathe. Instead, Richard's violence and Karen's glee buried him deeper, her uncle's shadow looming larger now, a puppet master pulling strings from the boardroom. The cuffs were off, but he was more trapped than ever, his brief triumph snatched by a captain who saw him as less than human. The guy in the Cubs cap zoomed in on the broken phone, the woman in the crimson blazer whispering, "This is wrong," but her voice was a wisp against the storm. Tom shrank back, his hands trembling, his betrayal unintentional but damning. The plane tilted slightly, descending toward Boise, its engines a steady hum that mocked Marcus's unraveling world. He'd built her eyes and wings to defy this, to rise above the hate, and now his own board was a battlefield. Karen's kin a dagger in his back. The coffee stain, the pepper spray, the mob, they were nothing compared to this corporate sabotage. A blow that cut to his core. Richard stepped back, his sneer a promise of more, while Karen's cackle rang in his ears, a sound he'd never unhear. The passengers watched, their judgment a heavy shroud, and Marcus slumped, his wrists free but his spirit caged. How had he missed this? What could he do, broken and betrayed, to reclaim his throne? The cabin lights dimmed, casting long shadows across his battered form, and he stared at the seat back ahead, its worn fabric a blur. He'd thought Lena's plan would save him, thought Tom's help would turn the tide, but they'd rigged the game tighter, a noose woven with family ties and brute force. The plane descended, Boise looming closer, and Marcus's mind ticked, searching for a spark. He'd faced worse, built empires from ash, but this was a beast he hadn't tamed. The sting in his eyes, the ache in his shoulder, they were fuel now, simmering under his skin, waiting for the moment to ignite. The first-class cabin of Flight 419 tilted sharply, its descent into Boise a jagged drop that matched the turmoil churning inside Marcus Tate. As the plane's engines whined, signaling the emergency landing his coup, Lena, had forced. His wrists, newly freed from the handcuffs thanks to Tom's shaky intervention, flexed with a pins and needles sting, but his shoulder throbbed where Captain Richard Dunn's fist had landed, a deep ache pulsing under his gray jacket. The coffee stain on his slacks mingled with pretzel crumbs and gum, a gritty testament to the mob's assault. While his eyes still watered from Karen Holt's pepper spray, the burn a constant nag. The burner phone, his last lifeline, lay shattered under Richard's boot, its glass shards glinting on the carpet like broken promises. Passengers braced themselves, seatbelts clicking, the guy in the Cubs cap gripping his phone, still filming, while the woman in the crimson blazer clutched her armrest, her face pale with dread. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows as the plane touched down, a rough jolt that rattled the overhead bins and sent a murmur through the cabin. Marcus peered out, catching glimpses of emergency vehicles swarming the tarmac. There, strobes painting the night in frantic pulses, FBI agents, clad in dark jackets, poured from a black van, their movements sharp and purposeful, a sight that twisted his gut tighter. Richard stood near the galley, his broad frame rigid, his steel gray eyes locked on Marcus with a glint of menace, while Karen paced beside him, her weary body twitching with anticipation, her blonde bun a wild tangle framing her pinched face. The plane rolled to a stop, its engines winding down, and Marcus felt the weight of the moment settle over him, a chance to turn this nightmare round. He'd lost everything, his watch, his phone, his dignity, but he still had his name, his truth, and he'd wield it like a blade. The cabin door hissed open, and 3 FBI agents stormed in, their boots thudding on the carpet, their faces stern under the harsh cabin lights. The lead agent, a lean man with a buzz cut and a badge gleaming on his chest, barked, "Marcus Tate." "Where is he?" Marcus stood, his 6-foot frame unfolding with a quiet power, his voice hoarse but steady. "That's me," he said, stepping into the aisle, his hands raised to show he wasn't a threat. The passengers gasped, a collective intake of breath, the guy in the Cubs cap zooming in, while the burly man in flannel muttered, "No way." Marcus reached into his sock, pulling out the slim digital badge he'd kept hidden, its screen flickering to life with his Horizon Wings CEO credentials, name, photo, title glowing in bold white text. "I'm the CEO of this airline," he declared, holding it up for the agents to see. "This is a setup. Check my records." The lead agent squinted at the badge, his brow furrowing, while his partners flanked him, their hands hovering near their holsters. The cabin fell silent, a stunned hush as the truth hung in the air, a bombshell Marcus thought would shatter their lies. The woman in the crimson blazer leaned forward, her eyes wide with hope, while Tom, near the bulkhead, nodded faintly, his freckled face flushed with relief. Marcus's chest swelled, a flicker of triumph warming his veins. He'd revealed himself, laid his cards bare, and the agents had to see it, had to back off. This was his plane, his empire, And he'd take it back, wouldn't he? The lead agent hesitated, his radio crackling as he muttered into it, confirming ID, and Marcus braced for the shift, the moment they'd unravel Karen's web. Then Karen exploded. "He stole that phone," she screamed, her voice a piercing wail that sliced through the silence, her finger jabbing at Marcus like a spear. "He's lying. He's a thief." Her words were wild, desperate, and Richard jumped in, his gruff voice booming. "She's right. He grabbed it off me during the scuffle." The lie was seamless, a tag team assault, and the passengers erupted, their doubt reigniting like a brush fire. The burly man shouted, "Check him," while the woman in the teal scarf yelled, "Don't trust him." The lead agent's face hardened, his moment of pause vanishing as he nodded to his partners. "Cuff him," he snapped, and before Marcus could protest, rough hands seized his arms, wrenching them back with a force that made his shoulders scream. Steel cuffs snapped on, tighter than before, cutting into his wrists as the agents dragged him toward the door. The cabin cheered, a roar of approval that drowned Marcus's shout. "That's my badge, my company," he yelled, twisting against their grip, but his voice was swallowed by the mob's glee. The guy in the Cubs cap whooped, filming his stumble, while the kid in the hoodie clapped, his mom grinning like she'd won a prize. Karen's smirk bloomed into a full grin, her blue eyes dancing with victory, and Richard folded his arms, his sneer a granite wall. The agents hauled Marcus down the aisle, his feet scraping the carpet, and he caught a glimpse of the tarmac through the open door. More lights, more agents, and a man in a sleek suit, silver hair gleaming under the floodlights. Karen's uncle. Marcus realized, his stomach plummeting, the board member Lena had warned about. Out there pulling strings, his smug face a mirror of Karen's triumph. They yanked him onto the jet bridge, the cold night air hitting his pepper-sprayed face like a slap, and Marcus stumbled, his knees buckling as the agents shoved him forward. The digital badge slipped from his grip, clattering to the ground, its screen flickering out as a boot crushed it underfoot. His truth, his proof, gone again, buried under their orchestrated chaos. He'd thought he'd won, thought the reveal would stop them cold, force the agents to see reason. Instead, Karen's scream and Richard's lie had flipped it, painting him a fraud in front of his own plane. The passengers' cheers echoed behind him, a chorus of hate, while the uncle's silhouette loomed ahead, a puppet master tightening the noose. Tom's head poked out the door, his eyes pleading, but he didn't move, his help too late, too weak. The tarmac spun, a blur of lights and shouts, and Marcus's chest burned. The cuffs of ice on his wrists, the coffee stain a trivial scar compared to this public shredding. He'd built horizon wings to defy this, to prove a black man could own the skies, and now his own crew, his own board, had turned it into a gallows. The agents dragged him toward a waiting van, their grips bruising, and he glimpsed Karen through the window, her grin a slash of venom. The uncle stepped closer, his polished shoes glinting, his voice a low murmur to the agents Marcus couldn't catch. How had he misjudged this so badly? What could he do, cuffed and stripped, to claw his way back? Hey, folks, what's your verdict on this wild turn? Comment number 1 if you're boiling at Karen's lie stealing Marcus's big reveal, or number 2 if you think he should have kept his CEO card hidden longer. Slam that like button if you're hooked on this tarmac takedown, and hit subscribe to catch every brutal twist as Marcus fights this rigged game. Did Karen's uncle just seal his fate, or is there a crack in this conspiracy? What's the FBI got up their sleeve now that he's in cuffs? Stay tuned, because the jailhouse is calling, and it's about to get uglier. The Boise tarmac faded into a cold blur as Marcus Tate was shoved into the back of an FBI van, its steel walls slamming shut with a clang that echoed in his skull. His wrists ached under the tight cuffs, the metal cutting into his skin, while his shoulder throbbed from Captain Richard Dunn's earlier blow. A dull pulse beneath his gray jacket, the coffee stain on his slacks mingled with pretzel crumbs and gum, a gritty residue of the mob's hate, and his eyes still burned from Karen Holt's pepper spray. The sting a persistent claw at his senses. The van lurched forward, tires screeching, and Marcus slumped against the bench, the agent's voices a muffled hum through the partition. His digital badge, his last proof of being Horizon Wing's CEO, lay crushed on the jet bridge. Its lasso wound deeper than the cuffs. The night swallowed him, Boise's lights streaking past, and he braced for what came next, his mind ticking like a clock with no hands. They hauled him into a squat, great precinct, its fluorescent buzz harsh against his raw eyes, and dumped him into a holding cell, the door clanging shut with a finality that rattled his bones. The room stank of sweat and bleach, its concrete, walls scarred with graffiti, a single bulb flickering overhead. Marcus paced, his sneakers scuffing the grimy floor, his breath shallow as he flexed his cuffed hands, the ache in his wrists a constant nag. He had one call, one shot, and he'd use it wisely. The burner was gone, smashed by Richard. But Lena was out there, a bulldog with a law degree, and she'd rip this apart. A guard, a stocky guy with a buzz cut and a badge reading Jenkins, unlocked the cuffs long enough for the call, his meaty hands lingering as he sneered. "Make it quick, Hotshot." Marcus rubbed his wrists, the blood rushing back with a sting, and punched Lena's number into the wall-mounted phone, its cord dangling like a lifeline. "Lena, it's me," he rasped, his voice hoarse from the spray. "FBI's got me in Boise. Karen's uncle's on the board, pushing to fire me. Get legal here now." Her reply crackled through, sharp and steady. "I'm on it, Marcus. Lawyers are en route, and I've got the board on notice. Hang tight." The line clicked dead, Jenkins yanking the receiver away, but Marcus's chest loosened, a flicker of hope sparking. Lawyers were coming, Lena was fighting, and he'd walk out of this cell, wouldn't he? He'd outlasted worse racist landlords, cutthroat investors, and this was just another hurdle. He sank onto the bench, his shoulders screaming as he leaned back, the cold steel a balm against his battered frame. The bulb buzzed, casting jagged shadows, and he waited, counting the minutes for rescue. The door slammed open, and two guards stormed in, Jenkins and a taller guy with a scar snaking down his cheek, their eyes glinting with a malice that made Marcus's gut lurch. "On your feet, Tate," Jenkins growled, his voice a low rumble of hate. Marcus stood, his hands raised, but before he could speak, Scarface swung, his fist crashing into Marcus's jaw with a crack that snapped his head back. Pain exploded, white-hot and blinding, and he staggered, tasting blood as Jenkins lunged, slamming a knee into his gut. The air whooshed out of him, his knees buckling, and he hit the floor, the concrete biting his palms. "Rich black boy thinks he's untouchable," Scarface spat, his boot driving into Marcus's ribs, a sickening crunch echoing as agony flared. Jenkins grabbed his hair, yanking his head up, and snarled, "You don't belong up there, owning planes. Know your place." Marcus coughed, blood flecking his lips, his vision swimming as the blows rained down, fists to his face, boots to his sides, a relentless storm of racial fury. He'd faced beatings before, kids in the old neighborhood, cops with itchy triggers, but this was a furnace, a hate so raw it burned through him. He fought back, swinging a wild fist that caught Jenkins in the nose, a wet snap sending the guard reeling with a howl. "You bastard!" Jenkins roared, blood streaming down his chin, but Marcus rolled, snatching a pen from the bench, its hidden chem blinking to life. He jabbed the record button, his hands shaking, capturing their snarls, their slurs, a desperate bid for proof. He'd win this, wouldn't he? Get it to Lena, expose them all. Scarface spotted it, his scarred face twisting with rage. "What's that?" he bellowed, lunging forward and ripping the pen from Marcus's grip, its plastic cracking as he hurled it against the wall. The cam snapped, shards skittering across the floor, and Jenkins stomped it, grinding the pieces under his boot with a grin. "No evidence for you, boy," he sneered, kicking Marcus again, the blow landing square on his chest, knocking the breath out of him. Marcus crumpled, his ribs screaming, blood pooling in his mouth, his victory shredded before it could take root. The door creaked, and a new shadow loomed, Karen's uncle, the silver-haired suit from the tarmac, his polished shoes glinting as he stepped in, his face a mask of smug calm. "You're finished, Tate," he said, his voice smooth as oil, a predator's purr. "Horizon's mine now." Marcus's head spun, the uncle's presence a gut punch worse than the boots. He'd thought Lena's lawyers would save him, thought the pen cam would turn the tide, but this was a conspiracy coiled tighter than the cuffs he'd shed. The guards stepped back, wiping blood from their knuckles, while the uncle loomed, his suit pristine against the cell's filth, the passengers' cheers, Karen's lies, Richard's fists. They were all threads in this man's web, a boardroom. Coup dressed up as justice. Marcus's chest heaved, each breath a dagger in his ribs. The coffee stain a child's scribble compared to the scars this night carved. He'd built her eyes and wings to defy this, to rise above the hate, and now it was a weapon turned against him, wielded by a man who'd waited in the shadows. The bulb flickered, casting the uncle's face in stark relief, his eyes cold and unyielding. Marcus slumped against the wall, blood dripping onto the concrete, his mind racing despite the pain. He'd thought he'd won, thought the call to Lena would pull him out, but the guard's brutality and the uncle's grin buried him deeper, a blow that dwarfed all before it. The cell stank, a mix of his blood and their sweat, and he stared at the pen's wreckage, his last hope ground to dust. How had he missed this snake on his board? What could he do? Beaten and broken, to strike back. The night pressed in, the precinct to tomb, and Marcus's breath rasped, a fighter's rhythm against the silence. He'd faced worse, turned slights into empires, but this was a beast he hadn't tamed. The uncle's shoes clicked as he turned to leave, a promise of more in his stride, while the guards smirked, their fists still curled. The coffee stain, the spray, the mob, they were nothing next to this. A personal vendetta that cut to his core. Marcus's eyes narrowed, blood crusting on his lips, and he vowed silently they'd pay. The bulb buzzed, a faint pulse in the dark, and he waited, a spark simmering in his veins, unbroken despite the storm. The Boise precinct cell was a cold, stinking tomb, its concrete walls slick with damp as Marcus Tate slumped against them, his body a map of pain from the guard's beating, ribs cracked, jaw swollen, blood crusting on his split lip. His gray jacket hung torn at the shoulder where Captain Richard Dunn had struck, and the coffee stain on his slacks mingled with dirt and blood, a gritty testament to the night's brutality. His eyes, still raw from Karen Holt's pepper spray, blinked against the flickering bulb overhead, its buzz a cruel metronome to his shallow breaths. The pen cam's wreckage lay scattered on the floor, his last proof smashed by the guards, while Karen's uncle's words, "You're finished," Tate echoed in his skull, a death knell from a boardroom traitor. The precinct hummed faintly. Beyond the bars, a distant pulse of life, but Marcus was a ghost here, caged and battered, waiting for Lena to pull him out. A key rattled in the lock, and the door swung open, revealing a harried lawyer in a rumpled suit, his tie askew, his briefcase clutched like a shield. "Marcus, it's me, Paul," he said, his voice a lifeline cutting through the haze. "Lena sent me. You're out, public pressure's too hot." Marcus pushed off the wall, wincing as his ribs protested, and staggered forward, his sneakers scuffing the grimy floor. Paul steadied him, his grip firm but gentle, and whispered, "She leaked the slap video. It's viral. People are pissed." Marcus's chest loosened, a spark flaring in the dark. The video, Greg's footage from the plane, the one he'd thought lost when Greg chickened out. Lena had gotten it, turned it into a weapon. He limped out, Paul guiding him through the precinct's maze, past sneering guards and into the night, where Boise's air hit his bruised face like a bomb. The precinct doors spat him onto the street, and he squinted against a wall of flashing cameras, reporters shouting over each other, their mix thrusting forward like spears. "Mr. Tate, is it true you're Horizon's CEO? What happened on that flight? Are you pressing charges?" The slap video had exploded online, millions of views painting him as a victim, Karen as a villain, and the world was roaring for justice. His hazel eyes, swollen but sharp, scanned the crowd, and he rasped, "I'm Marcus Tate, and I'll tell my story soon." Paul hustled him into a waiting car, its engine purring, and they peeled away, the mob of lenses fading behind. Marcus sank into the leather seat, his breath steadying, a flicker of triumph warming his veins. He'd won this round, hadn't he? The public's outrage, Lena's move, they'd forced his release, cracked the conspiracy wide open. The car sped toward a safe house, but Marcus's phone, handed back by Paul, retrieved from the precinct, buzzed with a news alert. He swiped it open, his gut lurching as a live feed blared. Karen's uncle, the silver-haired suit, stood at a podium, his polished voice slicing through the static. Marcus Tate is a violent fraud, he declared, his face a mask of calm authority. This doctored footage proves he attacked our crew first. The screen cut to grainy clips Marcus pinning the burly man on the plane, swinging at Jenkins in the cell edited to look unprovoked. His fight for survival twisted into aggression. The uncle's voice droned on. He's no CEO, just a con. Man exploiting her eyes and wings. Marcus's blood ran cold, the phone trembling in his grip. Doctored? His own footage, his truth, warped into a lie bigger than Karen's. The feed switched, and Karen appeared, her blonde hair neat now, her blue eyes brimming with crocodile tears. He assaulted me first, she sobbed, her voice quavering with rehearsed pain. I was terrified, defending myself. The slap was gone, erased from her narrative, replaced by a tale of a menacing black man terrorizing her. Commentators nodded, pundits chimed in. Looks like he played the victim card. Typical thug behavior. Marcus's stomach churned, bile rising as the car hit a pothole, jarring his ribs. The public's outrage flipped, a tidal wave of hate crashing back on him, fiercer than the mob on the plane. He'd thought he'd won, thought the video would bury them, but they'd turned it. A masterstroke that dwarfed all prior blows. He scrolled X, his phone lighting his bruised face, and saw the storm. Hashtags like #Tate the fraud trending, death threats flooding his mentions. Go back where you came from, a chorus of venom. Protesters swarmed his Chicago home, a news shopper catching bricks shattering his windows. Glass glinting on the lawn he'd mowed himself years ago. Paul cursed, they're relentless. But Marcus barely heard, his mind spinning. He dialed Lena, his voice a rasp. They've flipped it. Cops aren't helping protesters at my place. Her reply was clipped, furious. I'm on it. But they've got pull. Stay low. The call dropped, and Marcus stared out the window. Boise's streets a blur, his triumph ash in his mouth. The safe house loomed, a squat brick building tucked behind pines. But as the car slowed, headlights flashed, cops circling, their radios crackling. Paul tensed, they're not here to help. And Marcus saw it, smirks on their faces, hands on holsters, ignoring his call for protection. One tapped the window, his voice a drawl. Just checking. Tate, heard your trouble. They drove off, leaving Marcus exposed. The protesters' chants a distant roar he knew would find him. The coffee stain, the spray, the beating, they were nothing next to this. A media lynching orchestrated by Karen's uncle. Her tears the match to the gasoline. He'd built her eyes and wings to defy this, to prove his worth. And now it was a weapon shredding him apart. The car rolled into the garage, its door rattling shut, and Marcus limped out, Paul steadying him as they slipped inside. The safe house smelled of dust and old wood, its shadows long and heavy, and he sank onto a couch, his ribs screaming. His phone buzzed again, more alerts. Tate fired from Horizon Wings. Board vote unanimous. The uncle's coup was complete. His empire stolen mid-flight. He'd thought the video would save him, thought public rage would force justice. But they'd turned it. A racist witch hunt that buried his truth under lies. The protesters' bricks. The cops' smirks, they were a noose tightening. And he was running out of rope. How had he underestimated them so badly? What could he do? Battered and dethroned, to strike back? The room dimmed, the bulb overhead flickering like the one in the cell. And Marcus stared at the cracked screen of his phone, its glow harsh against his swollen face. He'd faced worse, turned slights into empires, but this was a beast he hadn't tamed. The coffee stain, the spray, the beating, they were scars, but this was a gutting, a personal vendetta that cut to his soul. Paul paced, muttering about legal moves, but Marcus's mind ticked, a fighter's rhythm against the silence. The uncle's voice, Karen's sobs, they were fuel now, simmering in his veins, waiting for the spark to ignite. The Boise safe house was a dim, dusty bunker, its pine-shrouded walls creaking as Marcus Tate slumped on a sagging couch, his body a canvas of pain, ribs cracked, jaw swollen, blood flaking from his lip onto the worn cushions. His gray jacket hung in tatters, the coffee stain on his slacks, a muddy smear beneath layers of dirt and pretzel crumbs, while his eyes, still raw from Karen Holt's pepper spray, stung under the flickering bulb overhead. His phone, its screen cracked from the precinct chaos, glowed faintly with the latest blow. Tate fired from Horizon Wings. Board vote unanimous. The media frenzy had gutted him. Karen's uncle twisting the slap video into a racist lie. That turned the world against him. Protesters shattering his Chicago home. Cops smirking instead of helping. Paul, the lawyer, paced the creaky floorboards. His tie a loose knot, his voice a low mutter about countersuits. But Marcus's mind was elsewhere, a fighter's pulse ticking beneath the wreckage. He'd lost everything, his watch, his burner, his empire, but he wasn't done. Lena, his coup, was still out there, a shadow warrior, and he had one play left, a desperate gambit to hit back. He grabbed the phone, ignoring the ache in his ribs, and dialed her, his voice a hoarse rasp. "Lena, it's me. Hack Horizon's system. Crashed the uncle's private jet empty, mid-flight. Send a message." Her pause was brief, her reply sharp. "Risky, Marcus, but I'm in. Give me 20 minutes." The line clicked dead, and Marcus leaned back, his breath shallow, a flicker of power sparking in his chest. The Uncle Karen's silver-haired kin had stolen his company, but Marcus would make him feel the heat. Show the board they'd picked the wrong enemy. He'd turn the tide, wouldn't he? Reclaim his throne with one bold strike. The minutes crawled, the safe houses, silence broken only by Paul's pacing and the faint hum of Boise's night beyond the pines. Marcus's phone buzzed, Lena's text lighting the gloom. Jets down, empty, as ordered. Boards freaking out, uncle's raging. A grin tugged at his swollen lip, blood cracking as he pictured the sleek Gulf Stream spiraling into an Idaho field, a fireball of his making. He dialed her again, his voice steadier. "Push it, Lena. Reinstate me. They'll bend now." Her reply crackled with grit. "On it." Boards voting, uncle's losing grip. The phone dropped to his lap, and Marcus stood, wincing as his ribs protested. A surge of triumph warming his veins. The crash had worked, a warning shot that flipped the script. Horizon was his again, wasn't it? The protesters, the media, they'd see the truth now. The TV in the corner flared to life, Paul flipping channels as breaking news blared. Horizon Wings jet crashes in Idaho, no casualties. Board reinstates CEO Marcus Tate amid chaos. Reporters swarmed, pundits stammered, and Marcus's chest swelled, his battered frame straightening. He grabbed the phone, patched into a live feed Lena had set up, and faced the camera, his voice raw but commanding. "I'm Marcus Tate, Horizon's CEO. What you've seen, Karen's slap, the lies, it's racism. Pure and simple. Passengers filmed it, not me. Here's the proof." He streamed raw footage from the plane clips the guy in the Cubs cap had posted before the uncle's spin, showing Karen's slap, the mob's hate, Richard's cuffs. The world watched, X lighting up with gasps, apologies, rage against the uncle's coup. Marcus leaned into the lens, his hazel eyes fierce. "I built this company to rise above hate. I'm back, and they'll pay." He cut the feed, his breath heaving, thinking he'd won, reclaimed his empire with truth and fire. Then the safe house door crashed open, wood splintering as Karen stormed in. Her weary frame a blur of fury, a sleek pistol gleaming in her trembling hand. "You'll pay," she screamed, her voice a banshee wail that froze Marcus mid-breath. Her blonde hair whipped wild, her blue eyes manic with a hate that burned hotter than the jet's wreckage. Paul lunged, "Drop it." But she swung the gun, its barrel glinting under the bulb, and fired. A deafening crack splitting the air. Marcus dove, his ribs screaming as he hit the floor. The bullet whizzing past his ear, shattering a lamp into a shower of glass. Karen shrieked, "You ruined me," and fired again, the shot ricocheting off the wall. A wild arc that caught her own shoulder, blood blooming red on her uniform as she staggered, her gun clattering to the boards. Marcus rolled, his hands scrabbling for cover behind the couch, his pulse a war drum in his ears. Karen crumpled, clutching her wound, her wails a mix of pain and rage. The pistol inches from her twitching fingers. Paul tackled her, pinning her, arms as she thrashed, her blood pooling on the floor, a crimson mirror to Marcus's own. "You're dead, Tate," she spat, her voice fading as shock set in, her eyes rolling back. Marcus staggered up, his ribs a furnace of pain, blood not. His splattered on his torn jacket. He'd thought he'd won, thought the jet crash and the footage would end it, bury them all. Instead, Karen's madness had turned victory into chaos, her gun a final, unhinged blow that nearly took his life. The safe house spun, glass crunching, under his sneakers as he leaned against the wall, his breath ragged. Paul tied Karen's hands with a cord, her moans a low hum, while sirens wailed in the distance. Boise's night erupting around them, the TV flickered, the news still praising his return. Oblivious to the shootout staining the floor, Marcus's chest burned, the coffee stain a child's scribble compared to this. A near-death strike from a woman he'd underestimated from the jump. He'd built her eyes and wings to defy this, to prove his worth, and now it was a battlefield. His triumph soaked in blood. Karen's uncle was raging, the board was his, but this was a wound he hadn't seen coming, a blow that dwarfed the slap that started it. The pines outside rustled, shadows dancing as red and blue lights pierced the dark, cops closing in. Marcus sank back, his ribs screaming, the phone buzzing with Lena's frantic texts he couldn't answer. He'd thought the footage would seal it, thought the crash would break them. But Karen's gun had flipped the game, a lethal twist that left him reeling. The safe house stank of gunpowder and blood, a tomb of his fleeting win, and he stared at Karen's crumpled form, her hate a mirror to the uncle's. How had he misjudged her so badly? What could he do, battered and bleeding, to end this war? The bulb flickered, casting jagged shadows across his bruised face, and Marcus's breath rasped, a fighter's rhythm against the chaos. He'd faced worse, turned slights into empires, but this was a beast he hadn't tamed. The coffee stain, the spray, the beating, they were scars, but this was a gutting, a personal vendetta that cut to his core. Paul shouted, "Cops are here," as boots thudded outside, and Marcus's mind ticked, a spark simmering in his veins, unbroken despite the storm. The Boise safe house was a war zone of shattered glass and blood, its pine-shrouded walls trembling as Marcus Tate leaned against them, his cracked ribs searing with each ragged breath, his gray jacket soaked with Karen Holt's blood from her. Ricochet wound. The coffee stain on his slacks was a faded footnote beneath layers of dirt, gum, and now crimson splatter, while his swollen jaw throbbed, blood flaking from his lip onto the dusty floorboards. The flickering bulb overhead buzzed, faintly, casting jagged shadows across his bruised face, still raw from her pepper spray days ago. Karen lay crumpled near the couch, her weary frame limp, her blonde hair matted with sweat and blood, her pistol kicked aside by Paul, the lawyer, who knelt over her, his hands trembling as he tied her wrists with a lamp cord. Sirens wailed closer, red and blue lights piercing the night through the cracked windows, and the TV droned on, its newsfeed still touting Marcus's her eyes and wings reinstatement. Oblivious to the shootout that had nearly ended him, Marcus staggered to his feet, his sneakers crunching glass as he clutched his ribs, the pain a white-hot flare that nearly dropped him. Paul glanced up, his rumpled suit streaked with dust, his voice a shaky thread. "Cops are here, Marcus. She's alive barely." Marcus nodded, his hazel eyes narrowing as he limped to the window, peering out at the swarm of flashing cruisers, officers spilling onto the lawn with guns drawn. His phone buzzed on the couch, its cracked screen glowing with Lena's texts. Boards solid. Uncle's under investigation jet crash linked to him. A grin tugged at his busted lip, blood cracking as he straightened. The jet crash, his desperate play, had rattled them, but Karen's gun had been the wild card. Her hate a bullet he'd dodged by inches. He'd survived, hadn't he? Turned the tide with Lena's hustle and the passenger's footage. The door burst open, cops flooding in, their boots stomping as they shouted, "Hands up." Marcus complied, his arms trembling, while Paul stepped back, palms raised. A burly officer cuffed Karen, her moans a low hum as medics rushed to her. Slapping gauze on her shoulder wound. Another cop, a weary guy with a buzz cut, eyed Marcus, his sneer familiar to familiar. "Tate, huh? Trouble follows you," he muttered, but didn't cuff him. His radio crackling with orders to stand down. Marcus's chest loosened, a breath he hadn't known he was holding slipping free. The news had shifted, the uncle's doctored lies unraveling. As passenger testimonies clips from the guy in the Cubs cap, the woman in the crimson blazer flooded X, drowning Karen's sobs with raw truth. The cops hauled her out, her head lolling, and Marcus watched, his mind ticking, a plan crystallizing. In the chaos, hours later, he sat in a Boise hospital room, its sterile stink sharp against his battered senses. And for dripping into his arm as bandages wrapped his ribs, his phone buzzed again. Lena's voice crackling through. Uncle's arrested, conspiracy, fraud. Emails leaked, tying him to Karen's lies and the jet sabotage. You're clear. Marcus's grin widened. Pain be damned, as he rasped, good. But I'm done, Lena. Sell Horizon. All of it. Her pause was heavy, stunned. Sell, Marcus. You fought for this. He cut her off, his voice steel. No system's worth this hate. Billions. Cash out, start fresh, she sighed, then agreed. Your call, it's done. He hung up, leaning back, the hospital bed creaking under his. Weight, a weight lifting from his soul. The twist came next, a revelation that rewrote the game. Days before, in that Boise cell, he'd planted the pen cam's data online, uploading it to a hidden server via a smuggled signal the guards never caught. When they smashed it, he'd let them think they'd won. But the footage, Karen's slap, Richard's cuffs, the guards' slurs had been cued to drop, timed with Lena's leaks. The uncle's arrest wasn't luck. It was Marcus's checkmate. A masterstroke from a broken man in a blood-soaked cell. He'd outsmarted them all, not with fists or guns, but with the quiet cunning they'd never seen coming. The hospital. TV flickered, news breaking. Horizon wings sold for $3 billion. Tate steps down, and Marcus's eyes glinted, a fighter's fire still burning. He rose, wincing as the fur tugged, and limped to the window. Boise's dawn painting the sky in streaks of gold. The coffee stain, the spray, the beating, they were scars. But selling Horizon was his defiance, a middle finger to a system that tried to grind him down. He'd walked away, not beaten, but victorious on his terms, leaving the uncle in cuffs, Karen in a hospital bed, and Richard facing inquiries from the leaked clips. The passengers' cheers, the media's hate, they'd faded, replaced by a quiet awe online. He played them all. Marcus turned from the window, his voice a low vow to the empty room. No one owns me. The $3 billion was freedom, a new start, but the question lingered. A shadow on the horizon, who'd dare cross him next? The hospital hummed, its sterile calm a stark contrast to the war he'd fought. And Marcus sank back, his ribs a dull ache, his busted lip curling into a smirk. He'd faced worse, turned slights into empires, and this beast, he'd tamed it, not by clinging to Horizon, but by letting it go, a move they'd never predict. The coffee stain was a memory, the spray a sting he'd outlasted, the beating, a price he'd paid. Karen's gun, the uncle's coup, they were blows he'd turned into his victory, a reversal that left them reeling. The dawn brightened, casting his shadow long and unbroken, and he waited, a spark simmering in his veins, ready for whatever came next. The room's silence wrapped him, the TV flickering off, and Marcus's mind drifted, a fighter's rhythm. Against the quiet, he'd built Horizon wings to defy hate, to prove his worth. And they'd tried to burn it down, Karen's slap, Richard's cuffs, the uncle's lies, the mob's bricks. But he'd flipped it, walked away richer, freer, a king who'd traded his crown for a sword. The hospital bed creaked as he shifted, his bandages tight, and he stared at the ceiling. The bulb's buzz gone, replaced by a stillness he'd earned. Who was next? The question hung, a challenge to the world, a promise that Marcus Tate was far from done. Marcus Tate's harrowing journey aboard Flight 419 unveils raw truths about resilience, systemic bias, and the power of truth in the face of unrelenting hate. The first lesson is unyielding perseverance. Marcus endured a slap, a mob, a beating, and betrayal, yet he never broke, turning each blow into fuel for his fight. His story shows that strength isn't just physical, it's the will to rise when the world tries to bury you. Second, it exposes the insidious reach of racism, from Karen's initial venom to the uncle's corporate coup, proving how prejudice can twist justice into a weapon against the innocent. Marcus's battle wasn't just personal, It was a stand against a system rigged to silence him. Third, strategic cunning shines through his planted footage, and the jet crash weren't reckless, but calcula. Ted, a reminder that brains can outlast brawn when the odds are stacked against you. Finally, his choice to sell Horizon Wings teaches us the courage to let go. Sometimes victory isn't holding on, but walking away on your terms. Richer in spirit and resources, this tale isn't just a thrill ride, it's a mirror to our world, urging us to question who we judge and why. It's a call to stand firm, speak truth, and outsmart the chaos no matter the cost. What hit you hardest, Marcus's grit, the betrayal, or his bold exit? Comment below with your takeaway. Hit like if this story stirred you, and subscribe for more tales of defiance against injustice. Share it to spark a conversation. How do we fight back when the system turns on us? Thanks for joining this journey. Here's to resilience and justice lighting your path ahead.